All right, so like I said, we're going to be talking about the Southern California Edison's Charge Ready Light Duty 2024 evaluation. We're going to go through a number of different, evaluations and findings based on that work. And we do have a question and answer chat that we'll be monitoring throughout. So drop your questions in there as you go, as things come up for you. But we ask that you save your questions, or we'll answer your questions at the end, and we can turn on people's cameras or audio if you want to ask your questions verbally as well. Okay, let's get to the agenda. So we'll start with just a brief overview of the program, talk a little bit about key findings from the 2024 evaluation, some highlights from implementation, and we'll go through the evaluation activities that we performed for the past year. And then we'll detail some of the key performance metrics that are in the evaluation report that are listed here. And then we'll, reflect on 2024, those key findings and recommendations, and look ahead to 2025 and what we're planning for this year's evaluation. And then, like I said, we'll do some questions and answers at the end. So again, drop your questions as they come up in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end, and we can turn on people's microphones and you can ask your questions verbally as well. So overview of the program design and a little bit of background. For those that are not familiar, overarching goal of the program is to support California's emissions reduction targets and local air quality goals. The program specifically is aimed at increasing the availability of EV charging infrastructure, again, specifically for light duty vehicles in Southern California service territory. And there's a real emphasis in this program on installing charging stations, charging infrastructure, serving multi-unit dwellings and disadvantaged communities in California, and offering rebates for those for broadly for customers in SCE service territory, but really focusing on those segments, specifically. The program began in 2021, and the total budget we have listed here for the program is $436 million. So there's an array of offerings here across the Charge Ready Light Duty umbrella. So the Make Ready expansion program, we have kind of listed the sub-programs here. So the Charging Infrastructure Rebate Program, CIR, is a component of the program that provides rebates on the utility side and customer side of the meter. Customer side Make Ready rebate program provides infrastructure just on the utility side of the meter. The Charge Ready Own and Operate program, or turnkey program, is where SCE installs, owns, and operates the charging stations, and this is geared towards multi-unit dwellings and disadvantaged communities. And then the Small Site Rebate program is really focused on bundling rebates for projects that are interested in installing 4 or fewer charging ports. There's also a Make Ready Direct Current Fast Charging program, DCFC, which is new to the portfolio in 2024. Provides utility side infrastructure and financial incentives for level 3 fast charging stations. We'll touch on this a little bit. This is, again, new in 2024, so a lot of interest in this program, but there's a limited budget as these charging stations are quite expensive. Charge Ready New Construction Rebate Program is focused on new construction for specifically multi-unit dwellings in the service territory. And then there's also a technical assistance component of the CRLD program. So Transportation Electrification Advisory Services, or TEAS, is really, providing customer support, technical assistance, helping with those site plans, familiarizing customers with, what it takes to really install EV charging stations. So some key findings that we want to hit on here, and we go into detail on a bunch of these later in the presentation. So between the inception of the program and 2021 through 2024, over 20,000 charging ports committed. And we'll get into what exactly that, means committed versus ports that are actually, installed and energized and functioning. But of those charging stations that are actually, available to charge, that represents 3,367 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in avoided emissions. And of all those 20,000 ports, over 20,000 ports that are committed, 53% of those offered through the Make Ready expansion program are located in disadvantaged communities. The demand for all the CRLD programs in 2024 remained really, really high. This has been kind of a through line since the inception of the program. Small site rebate, just to pick on one sub-program, applications nearly doubled from 2023 to 2024. I mentioned the DC fast charging program, really, really high demand for that program, 218 applications in its first year. So lots of interest in that component. And, to maximize cost effectiveness, it's worth noting that SCE has been prioritizing larger sites, especially in 2024. Some market insights that we observed in 2024 evaluation: average daily energy consumption really increased quite a bit, across the energized and, the charging stations that are available for use. So usage nearly doubled between 2023 and 2024. We have the exact kilowatt hours here, for average daily consumption. So real interest in not only, installing charging stations through the program, but also those charging stations are being used quite a bit more. And we also still, this is another through line, we observed a lack of understanding about the technical requirements to install EV charging stations and EV infrastructure in general. This is both on the customer side, the public, and also for some EVs been working with customers to install charging stations. And, based on secondary research, we noted that EV adoption really depends on, both the public perception of EV technology and availability of public charging stations. So, we found in other jurisdictions, and this is likely the case in SCE service territory as well, really understanding that charging stations are available, there are public charging stations, and then, again, the perception of EV technology in general really plays a big part in adoption trends. So just to hit on the evaluation activities that went into the more detailed research that we're going to present as we go here. Program tracking data analysis. This is really about, tracking applications through the various stages of the program. So we do that analysis. We also estimate overall usage and charging patterns, characterize load management. We do this in 2024 using advanced meter infrastructure data, so AMI data. So on the meter side, we'll talk about this when we get into the load management section, but we use AMI data because we don't have great coverage across all of the charging stations that are in operation on the EVSP side. So we don't have as good of coverage, at the charging station level and the port level. So we use AMI data from SCE so that we can get a broad understanding of, usage patterns across all the charging stations that are in use and available at this point. We also conducted a geographic analysis of EV adoption over the course of the program, from 2021 to 2024. This really gets at EV adoption broadly, but also public charging availability in some of those key customer segments that we mentioned: multi-unit dwellings and disadvantaged communities. We did a cost per port analysis, looking at utility side costs and comparing those with similar public charging programs available in the United States. And then we also conducted interviews with program staff and, staff within transportation electrification market incubation team. Additionally, we did some customer research to support the 2024 evaluation. So we launched a customer survey aimed at end users of charging stations in mid 2023. And so far, we've had 171 customer surveys completed. There's a QR code on the charging stations, based on those site hosts that are willing to let us, field the survey through their charging stations. And customers who use those charging stations or are passing by can scan the QR code and take the survey. And this is really about customer perceptions of EV charging technology and also satisfaction with the stations themselves. We also do, on a rolling basis, interviews with site hosts. So CRLD site hosts, we interviewed 16 between 2023 and 2024 that represented 22 sites that are energized and active. Our process here is to interview people 3 to 6 months after their charging stations are installed and energized and active. Again, get a sense of their satisfaction with the program and their experience with the charging stations now that they're in use, and experiences with their EVSP as they've worked through the process of developing a site plan, getting things installed and built and in operation. Overall experiences with the program, from site hosts perspective, process has been straightforward, clear, easy to navigate. Anecdotally, they've appreciated the one-on-one engagement and help in the site plan development process. That said, a couple of anecdotal notes from those interviews. Site installation of charging stations can be challenging. I'm sure that's not news to anybody on this call, but there's scheduling delays, miscommunications. There's delays in getting equipment, and that could affect compliance with interconnection requirements or other kind of code requirements. And then there's some operations and maintenance challenges, difficulty replacing parts, getting, charging stations that are not in operation tended to from a maintenance perspective. So these are not really necessarily reflective of, what the program does, but just challenges in the market in general, and, working through the installation and then operations and maintenance process for EV charging stations. So I just wanted to hit on some implementation efforts in 2024 that, rose to the top from our evaluation report. So the program team renewed their marketing efforts for the program in 2024, and they found that mass marketing, while effective, it's really the tailored one-on-one communications and focusing on specific market segments that's been really, really powerful. So I think, again, we all understand that a lot of these sites are very different based on whether it's a church or a golf course or a multi-unit dwelling. And they have specific needs, specific decision-making criteria. And the program team has found that both from a customer engagement, getting them interested in installing charging stations, and then also walking them through the process of, designing a site plan and moving through the various stages of participation. It's been really, really advantageous to have one-on-one customer engagement, and then specifically, teams of, customer engagement professionals that are geared towards those specific market segments. I think that's particularly been helpful to focus on the disadvantaged communities and multi-unit dwelling segments that are a key target for the CRLD program. I also mentioned kind of general education in the market being an issue, and that's kind of a through line over the last couple of evaluations. So to address this, the program team has kind of doubled down on various educational initiatives to address those knowledge gaps. So from training new trade allies and trade professionals through various, 4 different trainings that they put on in 2024, to seeking out individual, industry groups like apartment owners associations to, understand those specific customers' concerns and their, customer needs, updating the website and various marketing and other collateral, and then also, offering specific load management plans through the TEAS program has been, across the board specific initiatives that the CRLD program team has taken to address those knowledge gaps in the market. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key performance metrics, and I will hand it over to my colleague Shivani to talk about program participation.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Shivani. I'm a senior data engineer at Opinion Dynamics, and I closely work on the program participation analyses for the CRLD program. So the CRLD program was launched in 2021. By the end of 24, we have around 4,301 applications submitted in the program. That's over 86,000 total ports that were requested by these applications. 235 of these applications have been completed, and that's 4,088 ports that have been installed. The program is structured with multiple stages of review and approval levels that each application must go through. So once application is submitted, it moves through the pipeline, and after passing all the required approval stages, it's considered complete. So completed sites are the ones where the equipment is installed and is ready to use for the public. These different stages include application submission, screening, site planning, designing, construction, and then the final approval. We have observed that the process from submitting an application to getting the site completed takes somewhere around a few months to a year on an average, and the timeline depends on the program and can vary on the different stages the application is in. The CRLD program has received high market demand since it was launched in 2021. And in response to that, SCE created a wait list for Make Ready in the beginning of September 2022. And to ensure the DAC targets are met, SCE only accepted DAC applications into the waitlist for CIR, CSM, and turnkey. That's charging infrastructure rebate, customer site, Make Ready. And then in early 2024, SCE removed the waitlist for the non-DAC applications to come in. So as I mentioned earlier, they have a total of 4,301 total applications, and here's the breakdown by program. So charging infrastructure rebate has the maximum number of applications submitted. That's over 2,000 applications, followed by customer site Make Ready with 1,378, small site rebate, and DCFC fast charging with 218. These 218 were submitted in 2024. These 4,300 applications requested around 86,800 ports. And again, as you see here, CIR has the maximum number of ports requested, 41,600, followed by CSM with 34,942. Off of the 4,300 total applications, 235 have been completed, meaning the ports have been installed and they are ready to use for the customers. CIR again here has the maximum number of completed sites with 148, followed by customer side make ready, new construction, turnkey, and small site rebate. We do not have any completed sites for direct current fast charging yet, but they have requested around 1,932 ports in total. Now we'll look at the program targets. So the CRLD program has DAG and MUD targets. The Make Ready expansion that consists of charging infrastructure, rebate, customer side, Make Ready, turnkey, and small site rebate. They all had a target of, they all fall under the Make Ready expansion, and they all have target of 50% committed ports for DAGs and 30% committed ports for MUDs by end of 2026. The program is on track for Make Ready. As of now, we have 53% committed ports for DAG and 44% committed ports for MUDs. The new construction targets were at 50% for DAGs and 100% for MUDs. As we can see here, NCR has reached 22 at the 22% mark. For the DAG targets, we see an increase in growth year to year with 27% in 2023 to 46% in 2024, which means there's continued work towards increasing the DAG participation. But overall, program to date, it falls a little bit short. The MUD targets have been met with 100%. All the new construction rebate applications are also part of the MUD program. So here we are going to look at program participation by market sectors. There are a variety of market sectors. We have multi-unit dwelling, office buildings, public parking, schools, government facilities, and the other category consists of airports, public transit, small retail parking lots. So the graph here shows us the count of committed ports per market sector. And committed ports are those for which a customer has signed a CRLD a program agreement, and SCE has also reserved funds for those. But these counts do not include applications where the customer withdrew from the program after the agreement was made. So in total program to date, we have 20,330 committed ports. And as we can see, multi-unit dwelling has a maximum number of committed ports with 11,248, followed by office buildings, public parking, schools, government facility, and then all others clubbed together. The table below represents the amount of committed ports in 2024 alone relative to the number of committed ports program to date. As you can see here, MUDs have 26% ports committed in 2024, followed by office buildings, government facilities, others, and then schools. I will now hand it over to Shraddha, who will provide further insights on how charging pattern and consumption may vary with market sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani. My name is Shraddha. I'm a quantitative analyst at Opinion Dynamics, and I worked on the load management and grid integration analysis. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about the utilization of installed and energized applications. And energized applications here mean applications that have AMI data. So Paul mentioned earlier that we used AMI data for this analysis because it had the benefit of better coverage. And another note here is we received our AMI data at the meter level and not the port level. So to make the best comparisons, we rolled up the AMI data up to the application or site level. So in this section, I'm going to be talking about the consumption and energy demand of the applications. We'll be looking at daily load shapes, and I'll make a couple observations that we found about disadvantaged communities versus non-disadvantaged communities in their consumption, as well as market sector differences. So in this slide here, we see the total energy consumption over time. So the dark blue lines are the total usage for each day, and the light blue line at the bottom there that's like overlaid on top is the maximum occurrence of daily demand on each day. And the light blue line that's increasing towards the top is the number of energized applications. So as you can see over time, the number of energized applications increases and the trend of total usage increases along with that. And as more and more applications have joined the program, the usage has increased, and in 2023, the highest recorded daily consumption was 5,276 kilowatt hours, and that tripled in 2024 up to 14,772 kilowatt hours. And so we can see here that the trend of total usage is like pretty closely tracking the number of energized applications. The one exception we can kind of see here is around November 2023, where we see a jump in the number of energized applications. And it's just showing that though these applications were added to the program, they weren't immediately recording increased energy usage. So in addition to the increased number of energized applications contributing to the increase in total usage, we also see an increase in port utilization. So the average daily consumption per energized application nearly doubled from 2023 to 2024. So in 2023, it was 41 kilowatt hours, and it went up to 74 kilowatt hours. And if we subset down to the disadvantaged community applications, they make up 43% of the number of energized applications and account for 39% of the total consumption. And they showed the same trends as the overall. So we didn't include the disadvantaged community specific plot here, but just imagine this plot, but the axes are 39% of what you're seeing right now. All right, so this graph is showing the average hourly demand by market sector. We looked at office buildings, retail business centers and retail parking lots, multi-unit dwellings, public parking, and other. In this case, other is made of distribution centers and warehouses, government facilities, airports, and school facilities. And just to interpret what's going on here, if you look at the highest point of all the lines at like 10 or 11 a.m., that is the all other line. And around 10 a.m., an average application in the all other market segment on an average day is consuming around 12-ish kilowatt hours. So some trends that we found here is first, if you look at office buildings, which is the light blue line, that's the second highest, we see a lot of daytime charging. So you see it increases a lot in the morning as people get to work. We also see daytime charging in the retail business centers as well as public parking. Multi-unit dwellings have a lot more consistent consumption throughout the day. That is the line at the very bottom. But you can see if you look towards the end of the day, we see some overnight charging happening there. Also on this graph, we've highlighted in yellow the on-peak hours. So peak hours is when energy demand is the highest and also the price of energy is the highest. So the peak period accounts for 15% of charging across all of the sectors. And within the peak period across each of the segments, retail centers took up the highest share of charging at 22%, and multi-unit dwellings took up the lowest share at just 11%. And another analysis that we did was to look at the estimated greenhouse gas emissions in megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So we used guidance from the California Air Resources Board, their low carbon fuel standard, and we found that the program to date reductions total to a little over 3 million kilowatt hours, which translated to 3,367 megatons of CO2. So to make this conversion, we use an equation that incorporated the energy consumed as well as the energy economy ratio, which is a sort of like dimensionless factor that accounts for the difference in fuel efficiency. So it's roughly like the amount of electricity replacing gas in a light duty vehicle. We also used carbon intensity, which is the amount of CO2 emissions per unit of energy. So the carbon intensity changes over time, and we used hourly estimates per year and per quarter. So you can see that towards the middle of the day, the carbon intensity decreases, and that's also when the total consumption is at its highest. So 53% of the total consumption was occurring when the carbon intensity is low, specifically between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And this low carbon intensity can be attributed to the presence of renewables, especially solar. So the CO2 equivalents that were avoided translate roughly to around 379,000 gallons of gasoline consumed, or over 9 million miles driven. And to help further increase this impact, we can try to shift the energy consumption that happens in high carbon intensity periods of the day. So that would be 5 to 11 p.m. over to the low carbon intensity periods of the day to like utilize, I guess, a less carbon intensive period. 5 to 11 p.m. accounts for 20% of the load. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities to shift over to lower carbon intensity periods of the day. I'm going to pass it over now to my colleague, Evan. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Let me just get back on camera here. Right. So hi, yeah, I'm Evan Tinknell, an associate director, oversaw our market characterization study. So we'll take kind of a step back here and we'll be looking at some broader market trends across the SCE service territory in terms of EV adoption levels and public charging availability more broadly and specific to the CRLD installations. So we had a number of different research objectives here, but the original impetus was really gauging the SB 350 metric EV adoption at the service area level. And in some of our early conversations about what that research could look like and what we'd be quantifying, became clear that there was going to be some value in not just establishing EV adoption at the service area level at a given point in time, but kind of where that fits in this broader puzzle of EV adoption and EV market progress over the last few years. So we tried to kind of tell this story of not just what EV adoption looks like currently, but how it's kind of evolved alongside public charging availability and what role public charging plays in driving EV adoption, and as part of that, kind of exploring all the other elements and market drivers that play in there and barriers to EV adoption. So what we ended up with was a pretty broad landscape analysis where we did a literature review and had some conversations with SE staff and kind of explored the different drivers there. And then we also had this geographic analysis. So we'll be focusing here today on this GIS analysis we did, looking at that kind of comparative evolution of the EV market in terms of public charging availability from 2020 to 2024, and looking specifically at those CRLD public charging sites and how the development of those sites kind of relates to EV adoption levels over time. And we'll be narrowing in on some specific customer segments of interest, including these historically underserved customers that are an explicit point of emphasis for the CRLD offerings. All right, go to the next slide here. So I realize this one's a little bit hard to see, but I just wanted to give a bit of an overview here before we zoom in and look at some easier to read versions. So here we're looking at the whole SCE service territory. That's the black outline. On the left, we have 2020, and on the right is current, or 2024. The blue shading, which is a little hard to see, it'll be easier to see as we zoom in. The lighter blue shading is going to be lower levels of EV adoption, and as it gets darker, we're looking at higher levels of EV adoption. So that's based on California DMV data at the zip code level, so representing EV registrations as a portion of all light-duty vehicles. And then the green dots are all public charging sites. So that's from a DOE national database of all publicly available charging. And so you see on the left, it's just the green dots. On the right, when we get to 2024, we have orange dots there as well. Those are the active CRLD sites, or the currently available to the public CRLD sites as of 2024. And yeah, I'll come back to that as we zoom in. But yeah, we're looking here at essentially before or prior to the full launch of the CRLD offerings versus latest data available in 2024. All right, so here, this is the exact same information, but we're zoomed in on that coastal area. So this is the area around LA. And when you start to zoom in on these different portions of the territory, some of these patterns start to become a lot more clear. You can see all the outlines of the blue shading there. That's again at the zip code level. So that's EV adoption and showing how it's changed. So it's gotten higher incidences of EV registrations. And yeah, you can see pretty clearly there are quite a number of areas where EV adoption has increased, and overall public charging has also gotten a lot more prominent. But when you actually compare at the individual zip code level, they're not necessarily correlated with one another. So you're not necessarily seeing more EV adoption in the same areas that you're seeing increases in public charging. So not necessarily that closely aligned at the zip code level. But it's also, I guess, notable here, you can see all those orange dots on the right, all the CRLD active charging sites. So we're looking here, as of 2024, there were 234 active CRLD charging sites, but that's such a small fraction, as has been alluded to on the previous slides. Over 4,000 CRLD public charging installations are in progress. So there should be a lot more coming online, probably already over the course of 2025. So I guess the only other thing to mention here, these active CRLD sites as of 2024, they only account for about 5% of public charging overall, but they do account for almost 20% of the growth from 2020 to 2024. And as I mentioned, there's all these thousands more CRLD public charging sites in the works that are just taking some time to get online. So here we're looking at all of the same information. We've added one more layer. So all of the purple outline that you see there is indicating disadvantaged communities, or DACs. So those are going to be based on Cal Enviro Screen 4.0. They're a combination of air quality, income, and tribal land designations. So it can be any of the three. And then generally speaking, public charging is quite a bit more concentrated outside of those DAC areas, but CRLD sites are disproportionately more concentrated in the DACs than other public charging sites, which is an explicit emphasis of the CRLD offering. So what we're seeing here, about 20% of all public charging sites are in those DAC areas, compared with just over a third, 34% of CRLD sites, active CRLD sites, are located in those DACs. So that's marking essentially progress towards the CRLD target of having 50%, or at least 50% of CRLD charging sites in DAC areas. I guess the only other caveat to note with the DACs is they're, by definition, as I mentioned, they account for that combination of not only income levels, but air quality and tribal land designations. So there are some DAC areas that are notably more affluent. Some places, if you look here around Santa Monica or Long Beach, those are going to be DAC areas that are generally higher income and tend to have higher concentrations of EV adoption and public charging. So the next one here, instead of looking at disadvantaged communities, we are looking purely at income levels. So the purple is levels of income expressed as the percent of population below 80% of area median income. So it's a little convoluted, but essentially the darker purple is going to be lower income or higher incidences of lower income customers. And here, both maps are actually 2024. So we're looking at the entirety of the SCE service territory on the left there. And then this, I guess, urban snapshot, or the area around LA on the coast there on the right. So I guess one thing you can see here is the census tracts out in the eastern portion of the state are going to tend to have more low-income customers and tend to have lower EV adoption as well, and more limited public charging availability. All kind of goes hand in hand with being somewhat less populated as well. Still, looking overall here, the CRLD sites are disproportionately serving lower income areas. So just over 40% of all public charging sites are in those below average income areas, whereas 57% of the CRLD charging sites are in those lower income areas. And then, this is our last map here. So here, instead of income, we are looking at incidence of MUD housing, or multi-unit dwellings. So essentially the percent of the population that is in multifamily units. So this is at the block group level, all the red shading. But again, essentially darker red is going to be higher incidences of the population in multi-unit housing. So I guess the first thing to mention, public charging sites in general are more concentrated in these densely populated areas that tend to have more MUD housing. And the CRLD program has made a concerted effort to target those areas and actually to put public charging in MUD parking facilities, so actually on site at multi-unit housing. So just looking at the 230 some active CRLD sites, a third of them are actually at MUDs, at multi-unit housing. And then backing out a little bit and looking at what we're really showing on the maps here, the actual rates of public charging are pretty similar between CRLD and public charging overall in terms of their incidence in areas that have more multi-unit housing. So 3/4 of all public charging sites are located in those areas that have above average levels of MUD housing, compared with just over 2/3 of CRLD charging sites. Yeah, I think with that, I will hand things off to Molly to talk us through our last set of performance metrics here.
Great, thank you, Evan. So my name is Molly Shea. I am a consultant here at Opinion Dynamics, and my work on this evaluation was on the cost analysis. So the primary purpose of the cost analysis was to review the costs associated with running the Charge Ready Light Duty program, and then to compare those against other utilities with similar EV charging programs across the nation and in California specifically. So as you're looking at this table here, this is the cost associated with the SCE CRLD program, and you'll see that there are several program options on the left, the number of ports associated with each, and the average cost per port. And this is reflective of 104 financially closed out sites, where financially closed out is where the sites are completed, fully invoiced, all the work orders have been closed out, and all the rebates have been paid out as of the very end of 2024, December 31st. And you'll see that turnkey and direct current fast charging are not on this table, and that's because for direct current fast charging, DCFC, there has been no installations in 2024, and for turnkey, there was only one site represented. So we will be including those two in future evaluations, but for this year, we did not. What you might notice right away is that there is a big variation between the different program options, from almost $17,000 per port to $3,000 per port. And I'll flag, back in the beginning of the presentation, Paul walked through the different program offerings, and there's different ownership structures with each of them. For example, the CIR, Charging Infrastructure Rebate Program, has SCE provides infrastructure for the behind the meter and to the meter, the utility side and customer side of the EV infrastructure, whereas a program like the New Construction Rebate, they only supply a rebate for the program, like one overarching one. So the costs are very different depending on which program and how much ownership and involvement SCE has. And I also will caveat that this is reflective of ratepayer costs. This isn't the full picture. There are some other costs that aren't necessarily included in here, but this is reflective of the costs borne by Southern California Edison. So after we had SCE's costs, we went and reviewed publicly available reports. We ended up reviewing 18 different utilities across 11 different states. And the things that we were looking for when we were doing this literature review was programs that were very similar to the SCE CRLD program in size and just in like the bandwidth of their focuses and priorities, and also just to have cost information publicly available. We ended up finding out that a lot of publicly available reports did not report cost information, and of the ones that did, sometimes the costs did not mimic the same types of costs that was reported by SCE. So we wanted to ensure that the programs that we did find were very comparable to SCE's costs. And specifically, SCE has a strong focus on multi-unit dwellings and disadvantaged communities, so we wanted to make sure that the sites or the utilities that we were comparing against also had those focuses. So you can see on this graph at the very top, this is Charge Ready Light Duty costs. We have Duke Energy Florida, Connecticut, National Grid, and Excel. And you can see that the Charge Ready Light Duty program, the average would fall right around in between these four programs at the bottom. I will caveat that Duke is quite a bit lower, and that could be in part because of where it's geographically located compared to some of the other utilities that we have included in here, and also because the reporting period was earlier for Duke. I believe it was 2018 to 2021, and the rest of these programs happened 2021 or after, and costs have increased quite a bit over time. So we did end up with those 4 good comparisons though, and we did find that they fell right in the middle of those utilities. And in the future, we will go and include DCFC, the direct current fast charging program, and turnkey in our analysis, and potentially include a couple of additional utilities going forward. And with that being said, I will pass it back to Paul to wrap us up.
Thanks, Molly. Thanks everybody else for walking through those detailed slides. So I just wanted to hit on a couple of key successes in 2024. I think we've touched on all of these in the various key performance metrics in the intro section, but at a high level, program demand and progress. So really significant demand across all the different program offerings here, on track to meet the Make Ready disadvantaged community participation targets through the end of the cycle. Just specifically kind of zeroing in on something that Shivani presented, 53% of Make Ready expansion port commitments through the end of 2024 had been located in disadvantaged communities compared to 47% at the end of the year in 2023. So, big push from the program team on, again, specific market segments within disadvantaged communities, and that is kind of borne out in what we're seeing in terms of port commitments. Customer and support and education, I mentioned the focus on one-on-one support and engagement with customers, again, specifically disadvantaged communities, multi-unit dwellings, and zeroing in on specific customer segments, to reflect their needs and the outreach and engagement efforts. That translated into direct support, developing site plans. I think that was, always a part of the CRLD program team's, kind of role here, but really zeroing in on those specific segments has, been a focus in 2024. We mentioned the education efforts and with customers and trade professionals that's ongoing. That's been, again, a really important focus in 2024. Kind of reflecting that in terms of operations and staffing, expanding the networks of trade professionals familiar with the program has been a focus for the team in 2024. Again, hosting more trade ally trainings and trade professional trainings throughout the year. And then to kind of reflect the engagement piece, internally the team has structured themselves, from a project management standpoint around those specific customer and project types. And then, for those who had, reviewed or participated in this webinar in 2023, there was a switchgear issue. And so there's a new supplier in 2024. So they resolve, switchgear shortages, from the previous year. And that's resulted in quicker turnaround times to get equipment to customers. So just a couple of key recommendations that we wanted to highlight here. And this is detailed in our report, which is now publicly available on CPUC's website. But, hitting back on the training efforts for certain trade professionals. We heard this from site hosts. There continues to be knowledge gaps in the market, particularly around trade professionals. Those trainings that I mentioned that the CRLD program team offers are really focused on moving, through the program stages, which do coincide with, the technical requirements of installing a charging station. But we just, any other, training or linking training, related to the technical, aspects of installing charging stations and providing that direct support to customers, we think would be a valuable, thing for to invest in here. Encouraging charging during peak periods, periods with higher share of renewables on the grid, as Shraddha mentioned, we think could increase the, greenhouse gas reductions as a result of the charging activity through CRLD charging sites. And then Evan alluded to this a little bit in his presentation when we talked about market characterization, but continuing to promote the program broadly, not just to increase participation, but also to, let customers know that these charging stations exist. There's public charging available. And again, as Evan mentioned, this is one effort among many to increase public charging access, but through the literature, we have found that, increasing EV adoption comes hand in hand with promoting the availability of public charging and, the understanding of EV technology broadly and, specifically in those, neighborhoods, disadvantaged communities in and around multi-unit dwellings, just knowing that charging is available has helped increase EV adoption in other service territories in other states. So I did want to take a minute to highlight some of the evaluation activities that we have planned and are, currently undertaking for the 2025 evaluation. We'll continue to do program tracking data intake and analysis as we have in previous years. We will continue to do kind of that utilization analysis. We'll continue to intake and analyze metering data, so AMI data, but we will also have hopefully more coverage along the lines of EVSP data. So we're hoping to be able to provide more granular insights at the port and the charging station level. We will continue to do interviews with program staff and electric vehicle service providers as well. That's a new thing for 2025. We're going to actually speak to EVS to get their perspectives on, charging more broadly in Southern California, but then also their experience through the program and working with customers. And then also specifically hitting on, job creation and workforce development resulting from the program investments in SCE service territory. We'll continue to do analysis of project costs, as Molly mentioned, and then our customer research. So in-depth interviews with site hosts. We'll continue to do rolling surveys with end users of the charging stations, but we're also going to be launching some in-depth interviews with non-participating customers in those disadvantaged communities and, decision makers at multi-unit dwellings, just to understand barriers to, increasing participation in those market segments and identifying more specific needs for those customer bases, again, within those specific segments. So with that, we will open it up to questions if you all have any. I don't know that I see any in the Q&A, but Shihab, we can unmute folks, or if folks have questions, you can raise your hand and we can get to you. I see one there and a couple. Yeah, so we'll just answer them as they come in. So Timothy?
Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot for the information. Really good info. Love seeing how I'm with Pacific Gas and Electric. We're Northern Central California, so very close to SCE's program and our sister utilities down there. So good information. One thing I did in about 10 minutes into the 15 minutes in, you guys are talking about getting a hold of customers and getting survey information from them. I was curious because we run into a problem where we keep our main contacts will change. People will leave, new come in. And I was curious if you kept any record of, how many out of your customer contacts you had to go to for new contacts instead of the old people or the original contacts that you had that you were dealing with a program, and thus kind of muddy up a little bit of the information of what their opinion is on the program because they weren't the actual ones going through the whole process.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think you're specifically talking about site hosts.
Yes.
Yeah. So, we do get some help from the SCE, account management team to connect us to the right people. So we are relying, on that. But I don't know if you want to speak to this anecdotally, but I think we level set at the beginning of the interviews and make sure that we're the folks that we're speaking with have an understanding of the program. You want to speak to this?
Yeah, I would say that, for example, if I did 16 site host interviews last round, maybe about 6 of them will have changed, whether people are retiring or people are just changing to different jobs or whatever it is. Yeah, I do find that quite often, or I don't know, maybe like 25 to 30% of the time, it does change from when the application comes in.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's about what we see as well. So
yeah,
appreciate the info. Thanks.
Yep.
Ziga?
Hi, Ziga Ivanich from Clear Result Energetics. We evaluate the SRP, so their medium heavy duty program for SC. So I got all kinds of questions, but I'll try to sprinkle them in slowly, let other people ask too. But thank you for presenting your findings. Molly, when you compared the costs, when you did the benchmarking, were they sort of similar categories that went into it, just to the meter, behind the meter? Did they cover all behind the meter? Was it customer owned or utility owned? Can you speak to that? Because it was a big range from about 6,000 per port for Duke to 23,000 for Eversource. Just if you can speak to that a little bit, is it apples to apples, or it was really what the utility ended up paying per port?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I would say that each program varied a bit, but I will say that when we were searching for utilities, we were specifically looking for utilities that had similar cost structures. So we were trying to find ones that had behind the meter and to the meter involvement. There were several different sub-programs for each utility, so it varied a little bit by each. But yes, I will say it was similar. It wasn't exact, and each one had reported costs a little bit differently. But overall, yes, similar.
Okay, thank you. And one more, maybe I missed it, but do you guys look at time it takes from application or agreement signing to activation of the site? Or maybe that's in the report, just wasn't presented here, but that's another metric we look at closely.
We do. Do you want to speak to that, Shivani?
Yeah. So it takes, depending on the program and the stage, so it depends somewhere between to a few months to almost a year on an average is what we've seen in the past.
So from agreement signing to site being commissioned, it's done within a year, you're saying?
Within a year, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. John?
Yeah, John Powers with Alexity. Fantastic work. You mentioned the possibility in the future of encouraging more charging during cleaner periods and discouraging it during dirtier periods. How are these chargers all required to be externally controllable in some way? Can they be throttled? Can they be stalled? Can you pause charging during the dirty times? Can you, and I know this is not possible, but could you crank up the volume during times when it is cleaner? So is this like going to interact with some other form of load management program, or is this just the usual land grab for chargers? You don't have to answer the last piece because of course it's that, but will there be an element of control over the timing of charging? Or will it be price-based, or what did you have in mind when you said encourage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you spoke to a number of different strategies. I think we're getting into the demand response territory, which was not part of our evaluation. And so there's rates, there's demand response programs that I think there's requirements for customers who participate in this program to be at least enrolled in the time of use rate and the DR programs.
Okay.
So I won't speak to program requirements over there, but I'm curious, Hannah, if you have anything that you do want to add to John's question.
I think you sort of covered it in terms of like the way that the program is currently designed. Like it's the requirement to sort of be a part of those programs, but we're not necessarily evaluating as a part of this, like any changes that they might do as a part of that participation or anything like that. But yeah, it's a really great question in terms of like next steps for this, especially since it isn't like a lot of these are in the public charging space.
Well, and especially, are there requirements that charging infrastructure be either OpenADR compliant or any other form of externally controllable infrastructure?
We can get back to you on that.
Cool.
I think there are. I mean, there's certainly equipment requirements for the program that could speak to this, but I'll have to get back to you on the specifics there.
Yeah, you'll want to watch it on those fast chargers.
Any other questions? I see another one from Vika.
Thanks. One question on the public chargers. If you've looked at pricing, kind of going towards the clean versus dirty energy, but are time of use rates being passed on by the site hosts where public charging is available, and kind of what rate structures they might have. Just curious if that's something that's in the scope that you guys have looked at.
It's not, as I mentioned, we're not really focused on the time of use component or any of the demand response components that are kind of separate programs. So it's not really part of the scope that we looked at.
Okay, that's fair. And last one from me on the QR code, when you mentioned you put it on the chargers and you got 71 responses, if I understood correctly. Was that placed on every charger? Did you guys kind of put a sticker on it, or is it for a certain market sector? And how well do you think that worked? Would you do something differently? Or 171 seems like a pretty good number, but just curious for any feedback on that process.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways to do this. Our process is, we mentioned rolling basis. We interview site hosts, and then as we're interviewing them, we ask them about basically partnering with them to install or to put up the QR codes on their station. So in some instances, they'll put them on every other station. In some instances, we did a site visit where we went and put them on, all the stations. And so it really varies, depending on the site and how far the stations are apart from one another. We've had good success working with, those site hosts that we interview to actually put the laminated QR codes on the sites for a certain period of time. Usually it's about 2 weeks, but sometimes they stay up for a little bit longer. And yeah, as you mentioned, we've had, decent success getting folks to take those surveys. We have some questions in there for people who, don't own an EV and aren't actually using the charging station. So we've had, as you could imagine, somewhat more limited uptake on the survey there. But so far, I mean, that strategy's worked for us, across all the site hosts that have agreed to let us put up the survey QR code.
Nice. Are you guys
Yep.
providing some incentives for that? I imagine. Just curious if you can speak to that.
We had in the past, we don't do it anymore. It was pretty, minimal incentive, but I think, this is a group of people that are very interested in telling us their feedback about electric vehicle charging stations, and they're interested in the technology, I think. And so we're seeing people still motivated to participate in the survey without the incentive.
Nice. And is that summarized in the report, kind of the findings from that survey?
Yep, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. John, do you have another question?
No, sorry, I just can't use Teams.
It's okay. I want to make sure I got to you if your hand was still raised. Does anybody else have other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or just speak up or drop them in the Q&A.
I'm of curious nature, so just one more for site visits that you mentioned. Do you guys sort of sample a portion of the sites, or do you target a certain market? If you can speak to, how you do site visits and what information do you collect as part of that?
Yeah, I mentioned site visits. I mean, I think that's been kind of a pretty sparse effort on our part, just to, observe the charging stations in the field. And there was a specific instance where, a site host had asked us, they didn't want to put up the QR code. And so we went out there to put up the QR code for the surveys. And so that was a specific driver. So there's not really like a technical component to the site visits. But as far as the site host interviews, we're doing those on a rolling basis, and we're, more or less attempting to contact as many site hosts who will speak to us from those, folks who have active, energized, working charging stations, and they've been so about 3 to 6 months by the time we reach out to them for an interview.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before we wrap up today? Okay. Well, thank you all for your time. We really appreciate your interest in the program and the evaluation. As I mentioned, as of today, the evaluation report from 2024 is available on CPUC's website. We will follow up with this recording to those who registered, and feel free to share it. And yeah, again, thank you for your time. We appreciate your interest.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.